They went down under a sky the color of old iron, following a map made of sound and memory, until the light of the surface became a thin coin and the ship lay beneath them like a sleeping city. The submersible's camera peeled back layers of time. Barnacle laces, curtains of rust, the ghostly architecture of promenades and staterooms. And then, in a dark pocket where steel had folded in on itself, something caught the beam and held it. A ribbon of burnished metal, enormous and impossible in the cold blue. It lay braided and coiled like a sleeping leviathan, as if the ship had been hiding not only people and luggage but ceremony itself. The first impression was physical, the scale of the objects. These were not loose trinkets or scattered coins. These were links the size of a man's torso, chains braided and hammered to hold weight and to catch light. They had the appearance of gold, yet their surfaces, dented, encrusted, fused with centuries of salt, suggested they had been engineered as spectacle. Near them, items that belonged to daily life lay as if dropped in haste. A program folded in three, a child's knitted cap, a woman's opera glove pressed between seat cushions like a soft relic. The juxtaposition was jarring. Ceremony and intimacy sat side by side, their histories braided together. As the story of the discovery unfolded, it became clear that this was not a simple cache. The chains were arranged around a hollow, carved in the ship's belly, a deliberate pocket within a structure that otherwise had no business holding such things. The pocket's architecture hinted at planning, supports, straps, and anchor points that suggested the chains were meant to be displayed or worn, part of a procession perhaps, or a ceremonial harness. For historians, it was a rare intersection of nautical engineering and social choreography, a place where performance met the practical constraints of a steamship. The team worked with the kind of slow, surgical attention demanded by the deep. Cameras documented every fragment, laser scanners painted three-dimensional maps. Before anything was moved, every angle was recorded, so that the theater of the wreck could be reassembled in the mind if it could not be under the ocean. Conservationists debated in low voices about what to retrieve and what to leave. The site was a grave, a museum, an archive, and an ethical challenge all at once. When objects were recovered, it was with cranes and lifts designed to cradle them like living things. Link by link, chain by chain, the metal came to the surface. Its weight was physical proof of the find, testaments to craft and wealth, heavy, with intent. Under high-intensity lights and the sterile air of a stabilization lab, the metal revealed its secrets. Microscopic analysis suggested alloys and impurities that spoke of specialized forging techniques. Traces of gilding and the faint residues of fabrics hinted at ceremonial use. Entwined among the links were fibers and leather thongs, now petrified with salt, which suggested that the chains had been worn, not merely stored, and that they had been part of garments or regalia intended to be seen. The narrative widened from metal to people. Passenger lists were scoured, private letters and scrapbooks examined, social pages from illustrated newspapers pored over for clues. In the era the ship sailed, ceremony had its choreography. Processions, medallions, regalia for events where the pomp of display was inseparable from identity. The chains then invited hypothesis. Were they part of a theatrical production, a philanthropic procession staged for an invited audience? Or were they gifts destined for some foreign court, packed and then ferried within the ship's ornate entrails? Each possibility was a doorway into the social history of the time, and the objects now outside their watery context became translators of an older language of prestige. But the treasure's guardians were not only human memory. As divers went back to document and retrieve, they met movement in the dark that was not metal and not man. Long, sinuous shapes unfurled from the wreck like ink stains given life. Sea snakes, slender, gleaming, and swifter than anything the EGE team had expected at that depth, slithered through the metal, threading through links and weaving around timbers, as if the chains had called them home. They were neither mere curiosities nor harmless denizens. Their presence reconfigured the expedition's rhythm. Where machines could pry and light could map, the living creatures introduced an unpredictability older than maps. The first encounter was quiet and unnerving. A diver's floodlight caught a ribbon of motion, and for a breath the light seemed to bend. The snake, its body banded in dull iridescence, its head tipped with a line of reflexive curiosity, rose and undulated, almost theatrical. Divers, trained for hazards of pressure and cold, had to adjust to another variable: animal agency. The snakes moved with the same intent the team had seen in the positioning of the chains, as if they were part of a different custodial order. Their coiling around the metal suggested not random occupation, but relationship. The wreck had become an ecosystem, and the treasure, its centerpiece. Encounters multiplied. Eels and ophidian forms slipped between links and rested in the hollows carved by human hands. At times, the creatures seemed indifferent, drifting like flora in the current. At other moments, they behaved like sentinels, gathering in ranks that suggested shape and intent. There were instances when several snakes raised their heads in unison as a diver approached, bodies forming a living barricade between man and metal. The effect on the crew was visceral. What had been a technical mission acquired a mythic frisson. Humans and snakes circling an object that bound them both across time. The production chose to treat these animals with respect. Divers did not bait or provoke. Every interaction was documented at a distance, using the light and the language of movement rather than force. In interviews later, some team members described a sense of being watched by a living audience. The snakes were not beasts to be conquered, but actors in a longer story. Their presence a reminder that the wreck was not an archaeological site in the abstract, but a new habitat that had been forming its own narrative since the ship sank. As objects were conserved and catalogued, the chain's companion pieces surfaced small, human details that converted spectacle into story. Medallions with heraldic motifs, rosettes of silk and metal, and fragments of embroidered banners suggested ceremonial garb. A gilded clasp revealed the maker's stamp, a small, painstaking hallmark that led researchers to a workshop known for supplying royal and civic pageantry. That connection suggested an origin beyond mere theatre. These items might have been commissioned for diplomatic display or for a procession associated with a civic institution. Further along that line of inquiry, historians found reports in colonial dispatches and shipping manifests that supported the notion that luxury items intended as diplomatic offerings often moved by sea, wrapped in layers of packing and secrecy. Personal. Artifacts told an even quieter tale. A locket carried a powdered curl of hair. A theatre program printed on fine paper bore a tiny grease stain and was folded exactly where a thumb might have held it. A man's glove retained the sedimented pattern of a watch chain. These objects gave the scene the texture of a moment, an evening at which people had dressed and gathered, where rituals were performed and then, in the smallest of gestures, interrupted. The presence of children's toys among the chains, the stray ribbon from a bonnet, the toppling of a small stool, each suggested that this was not only a spectacle of public ceremony, but a domestic moment gone awry. The rescue and restoration processes were methodical and reverent. Fabrics soaked for decades were slowly desalinized in baths that mimicked the gradient of the ocean's pressure, coaxing fibers to rehydrate without splitting. Metal was stabilized to arrest corrosion, then analyzed spectroscopically to determine composition and craft. Each artifact became a project, its treatment a question of conservation ethics. How much intervention honored the item's material history without erasing the patina of time? In the public eye, the recovered pieces were sometimes sensationalized. Gold chains from the Titanic, but museums and conservators insisted on context. Objects were not trophies, they were evidence. Exhibitions that followed sought to balance spectacle and solemnity. Curators reconstructed a portion of the pocket in a dim gallery, placing the chains in a carefully lit environment that emphasized scale and texture while preventing glare. Nearby, vitrines held the smaller objects with placards that traced provenance and posed the ethical questions raised by retrieval. Soundscapes, distant engines, the hush of currents, the low hum of conservation labs accompanied visitors through the space. The effect was intentionally disquieting. The museum did not want to offer the comfort of a tidy narrative, but the complexity of a relationship between human history and the living sea. Scholars debated the implications of the find. Some argued that the chains revealed how the shipping networks of the age served as pipelines of ceremonial capital, transporting objects that cemented alliances and prestige across oceans. Others focused on the site's modern life as an ecosystem, arguing that any intervention must account as much for biological impacts as for historical interpretation. There were voices who cautioned against turning the wreck into a theme park, warning that the collision of commerce and memory could trivialize the human cost at its core. In conferences and roundtable discussions, speakers returned again and again to a core question: how do we honor both the dead and the living parties involved in a site that is at once grave and habitat? The divers' accounts added human tension to the intellectual debate. One veteran recounted a moment when a cluster of snakes gathered near a chain, as if to shield it from a thruster's wash. The team paused, not out of fear of harm, but from an instinctive respect. The diver's handheld light skimmed the surface of the metal and revealed a pattern of pitting that matched the weave of the leather remnants. In his memory, the snake's movements were not threatening but purposeful, like guardians at a gate. For other crew members, the animal's presence became a daily reality to incorporate into planning. No longer an aberration, but a variable to design around. In the public imagination, the story took on mythic colors. Journalists wrote of guardians, of treasure, of the romance of recovered gold. But the documentary insisted on nuance. The chains, while dazzling, were not a solution to history's tragedies. They were evidence of the wealth and networks that both made the ship possible and made its hierarchy visible. The snakes were not supernatural sentries, but living beings that had repurposed a human catastrophe into a habitat. Both interpretations, of the chains as artifacts of culture and of the creatures as part of an emergent ecology, could be held together without contradiction. Toward the end of the expedition season, a ritual evolved. At dawn, before the surface air warmed and the wind rose, the team would convene to review the day's footage. They compared sonar sweeps, cross-checked lab results, and argued about interpretation. At the heart of the argument was not ownership, but responsibility. How to narrate a story that belonged to many.